Hello, I'm Sue Andersen, grief guide and yoga teacher, dedicated to helping individuals navigate the challenging journey of loss. Welcome to Growth from Grief, where I aim to offer strategies to transition from the depths of grief to the path of healing. Whatever loss you are grappling with, here you'll discover support to ease both the physical and emotional burdens of grief. Together, let's embark on a journey towards strength, peace, and healing. I'm so glad you are here. Hi. In today's episode, I'm speaking with the Reverend Krysia Burnham. And Krysia is an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ, where she's a chaplain caring for people at end of life and supporting their families. Krysia is also a veteran hospice chaplain who has created and led virtual bereavement support groups since the start of COVID-19. She's currently a candidate for the doctorate in ministry at Boston University School of Theology, where her dissertation will focus on the use of expressive writing and movement to tend to those in times of loss and change. And in this episode, Krysia and I will talk about how we met and our common goals in terms of working with people who are grieving loss, and maybe some things that we want to try to do together. So I'm really happy to be speaking with her and sharing her viewpoint with you, and all the good things that she does as a hospice chaplain. So let's take it away without further ado. And here's my conversation with Krysia. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Growth from Grief. I'm so happy to be here with my friend, the Reverend Krysia Burnham. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we have known each other for actually not a very long time. And I wanted to start by first welcoming Krysia and talking a little bit about how we got together. So welcome, Krysia. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. You're welcome. You're welcome. So it's funny, prior to the recording, we were just talking about how it's only been like 11 months since we first connected, but it feels like we've known each other for 5 years. And I think that goes to, the power of connection. And when you really feel like you're, connected to somebody, and it's important for both of you in terms of, your mission and what you're doing in this world. So that was just kind of funny as we were chatting about that. But I did want to mention and just sort of start the conversation by talking a little bit about how we met. And how we met was that Krysia had sent me an email. So I mentioned again in the introduction that she is a hospice chaplain and she does virtual grief groups. And so she was looking for something, another dimension to add to these virtual groups, and had sent me an email to see if I'd be interested in doing some collaboration with her. And so that's how we got talking. And we're still talking. We're still thinking about things that we want to do together in terms of collaboration. But Krysia, I wanted to ask you, why is this work so important to you? This work as that you've been doing for many years. And I didn't actually start by saying how long you've been a hospice chaplain, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about sort of how you got into this line of work from your other work as a writer.
Oh, I'd be glad to. It's a story I like to think about and share and retell because it helps me realize sort of the power of universal love and kind of blessing that is available to us sometimes if we're open to it. And yeah, so I was a journalist. My first career was in magazines from my early 20s on. I started at the New Yorker magazine, which was super glamorous. And in fact, I was a typist there. As it was a starting job, and was a great entry into the world of journalism at the time. And I went on to become a magazine writer and editor at Vogue and European Travel and Life, which was a Murdoch magazine, and a couple other places. And then our path, my husband and I, led to the Middle East, where we sort of left everything and moved to Istanbul. We were going to do a 2-year adult gap year kind of a situation. And we ended up staying 11 years, and we had our family
Wow.
there. And Istanbul is a really one of the great cities of the world, right? And it's so spiritually and culturally fascinating. There's this overlay of Islam and Christianity, ancient Christianity, and a tiny bit of Judaism, and a lot of different cultures end up there. And so it was there that I um, came back into church attendance, an international church, and just felt very inspired by the place, and started this kind of like little uh, um, I was going to say tingling. I don't know if that's the right word. Just kind of like a little sparkle of, hey, what do I want to do with my one wild and precious life? Um, as Mary Oliver writes so beautifully. And long story short, 9/11 happened, and we came back to the States because we felt like we wanted to be home
Mm.
after that and be with our family. So we did, and we decided to move to Boston, where we had some of my husband's family lives. And I was kind of still dabbling in journalism, being a mom, and trying to figure out my next steps. And it so happens that we got a house pretty much down the road, about not even 10 minutes from a divinity school. And I ended up going there almost as like a hobby, and then later, much later, like years later, finishing there with a degree in divinity. And so that was a big period of discernment where I felt the call to ministry. It's like a spiritual, process, right? Really, the call to
Hmm.
anything, the call to yoga, the call to writing can be also very spiritual. I didn't plan on going into the ministry, but that's kind of the profession that chose me. And it's actually fast forward to 2013. My mom was very sick at the time. She had had a bunch of neurological things go wrong, but had been a trooper and had lasted through that many years. But she was at the end, and she was on hospice, which I had zero experience with, even though I was in training for the ministry and had already had some chaplaincy training at that point. But when hospice came in and tended to her mostly beautifully, some things that they did I did not like. I was like, note to self, I think this could be better. And I kind of in that space, Sue, I saw myself like entering into that conversation at the bedside and being able to be in those sacred spaces with folks who are at they're at a turning point. They're
Hmm.
between dimensions and varying levels of cognition. So um I was really moved by the work that the hospice did. And my mom actually passed that Christmas 2013, and I started becoming a volunteer and really just dabbling in hospice, and eventually was able to become a per diem, and then a half-time, and later full-time. So total, I would say, it was roughly 15 years I've been a chaplain in hospice. I
Okay.
did have some time in the parish and in the hospital as well, but really hospice is what calls to my heart. And so I'm now serving a population in Metro Boston for the oldest hospice in the Commonwealth. It's called Care Dimensions. So everything's kind of come full circle.
Wow. Yeah, that's very inspiring. I know also that you had a personal experience of loss early on in your marriage, and that added, I'm sure, some dimension to this as well, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. That's an important part of the story. I'm sort of, I've developed a version of that without this experience because it can be so personal. It's
Yes.
not every context that can accept it, but thank you for asking. And you and I have chatted about this before. So when I was 30 years old, I got pregnant with our first child. We were living in the New York area, and I'm from New York, so we're living in the New York area before we went to Istanbul. And we were pregnant, and things were going okay up until I want to say 5.5 months through the, obviously 10-month pregnancy, and I started going into labor. And
Mm,
I didn't really know what labor was. This is my first kid, but I was pretty different. So I did eventually go into the OB's office, and interestingly, he minimized it and said, "Oh, it's just false labor. Just go home and rest," which was the wrong thing to say because I was in active labor. And anyway, I went into labor and then met him later in the hospital, emergently. And unfortunately, we found out later, an infection of I think it's called chorioamniotic fluid. Something was infected in a way that basically started the pregnancy at the wrong time. And so our daughter was born. So that was April 1991.
mm,
And she was born April 27th, and she was very premature. Um, However, when it's your kid, you don't really notice that, or like you don't really, that's not what's on your mind. It's just your child.
right.
And I was, on a lot of meds and stuff, but she was born, and she died in my husband Steve's arms that day. So she was born and died on April 27th. And
Mm,
her gravestone is at a place where we go for the summer and we visit her. Um, and I think that experience, Sue, and I know you know this all too well, sadly, it's life changing, right? It just doesn't,
mm,
it's not the same afterwards. And
right, right.
so we had quite a hard time with that grief. It wasn't easy. Sometimes people, grieve differently, which was the case. We were both young working people, so we were like had to kind of stop out from work for a little bit. And what it did do, though, is it empowered me to think about what can I do? I've lived through this. I'm still alive. My child is not, which is horrific. And um, what can I do? What can I do for the next person?
Right.
Super quick side note, I happen to have had a labor and delivery nurse who I think was also a doula, and I believe was from some UK country. She had this lovely accent, and she was amazing, and she helped me through everything, including sort of looking at what the bereavement might look like. And she
Hmm.
made us footprints, and she made us like a birth certificate. And so I have a whole basket, that's Eleanor's basket that I don't usually go looking for, but I do have her footprints on in my bedroom. And so, she is a very real person, right? Even though she was a tiny preemie who died
Right.
halfway through a pregnancy. And long story short, that was the catalyst for me to start looking into how to become a bereavement, like a lay at that time bereavement counselor. I never really did that then, but I did. It inspired, I think, my ministry later on.
Sure. Yeah. And I think also, excuse me, the time frame that you're talking about, people did not talk about this. It just was not talked about. And I mean, before my son was born, I had two miscarriages, which, people were, I don't know, it was just very weird. You were just expected to kind of go on. And I remember years later finding out when I was doing family history, my family history, finding out that, like, oh, this grandmother had, a stillborn child, and this aunt had, a still, or whatever. And it was just amazing because you would never know that. People didn't really talk about it. And I feel like nowadays, this day and age, it's a little bit more, um, people are more willing to talk about it. And there's groups to help people grieving infant loss
Yeah.
and, and pregnancy loss. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because I remember some of my husband's extended family, like his cousins' wives and people like that who weren't my closest family, but they were my family. I remember them coming and visiting me and sitting on our back deck and them saying, this happened to me too. And that would never have come up if for,
Right.
but for this. And I felt like, okay, so this happens to women and I'm not a freak. And, God willing, I will go on to have children, more children someday. I mean, I wasn't really thinking about that then, but I thought, well, is every pregnancy going to be like this? Am I just going to
Right.
not have kids? And
Right.
yeah, I'm so glad people talk about grief more now. And
Mhm.
that's really kind of become my business, if you will, is
Sure.
talking about
Yeah.
grief, helping people, voice what's going on for them.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's so important. Um, so I wanted to just shift the conversation a little bit and have you explain a little bit more about the, the a hospice chaplain. Like what is that role? Because when I think about hospice, I know a few people that were very ill and had hospice care. But when I think about that, I just remember like nurses, you know, and so
Mhm.
I don't know if they had other care. I just remember it was about nurses. So can you talk a little bit about that and the maybe the important role that you play, not just for the person who is dying, but for their family?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's such a good question. And, Sue, I think people don't really broadly understand what hospice is until they're smack in the middle of it, as I was. That happened to me too. And hospice is from it's a Latin root word. It's hospes, which means guest. So it's the same root word as hospital and hospitality, which I
Okay.
find cool as a word person because originally, hospice was a guest house. And there's a beautiful poem called The Guest House by Rumi, if you want to
Yes.
look it up, right? Yeah, you probably know
Yes.
that poem. And so it's like the guest houses were places, I think, on the road. There was, people were, I guess, walking by foot. This is the Middle Ages or something, early Middle Ages. And so people were walking by foot from place to place. And there are these guest houses along the way, probably still exist in, along the pilgrimage road. I don't know. So, it's a place of welcome. It's a place of sanctuary, place of safety, comfort, and then eventually grew into hospital and hospice where there's medical care too. And so hospice is actually kind of the opposite of what people think, which is a death sentence. When
Right.
you have a terminal illness and your physician, your specialist says, I'm really sorry, we can't do anything for you, more for you. It feels like a death sentence and feels like I've had people say, they gave up on me. Um, the medical establishment has like
Mhm.
thrown me out, and it's, well, hospice is your only option. Well, from a hospice point of view, that's not untrue. And we who work in hospice feel it's kind of like death doulas and things like that. Like we feel there is a beauty and a sacredness and the possibility of peace and maybe even hope. And, your hope changes drastically, but hope is still possible. And a kind of what's a good word? Like a place where you can come into your dying process and it won't be scary and it'll be as painless as possible. That's the medical part. We do so well.
Right.
And oops. And like meaning making. There can be meaning making there.
Right.
And so hospice is a team of trained professionals. You have a hospice physician, hospice nurses. You're right, absolutely. Very nursing driven business. When I say business, I mean it is a business, but it's not a business to me. It's a
Right.
calling. Social workers, chaplains, they call us spiritual counselors now. Volunteers, huge part of hospice, volunteers who come and sit with people, and nurses aides. And then you have a massive group of people in the back office doing all the admin. So it's really large teams of people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, when you look at all the teams, like in care dimensions, we have 1,000 people on our service every day, like that's our daily count. So it's a pretty large operation. And so you have to have that physician in the hospital or wherever your physician is sign you onto hospice, and you have to have the hospice physician sign. People don't realize it takes two doctors to sign, and what they sign is a piece of paper that says, um, Ms. Jones, you have approximately 6 months or less to live if your terminal disease goes its course. It's sort of like expected course, um, which sometimes it goes way quicker and sometimes it goes much longer, depending on a ton of things. So that's
Sure.
why it's, yes, it could be the end of the road. And some people do graduate from hospice because our care is so good, they actually leave. So it is a 6 month benchmark. I think the average length of stay is 30 days if you take all the people and
Mm-hmm.
average it out. So I don't know math, but like that's a kind of a maybe um that's the math of it, is that it's 30 days. But I see people on a lot longer, honestly. Not to give people false hope, but so the chaplain, spiritual caregiver, comes in as part of that team, and we do our spiritual assessment. Like the nurse will take your vitals and the doctor will make sure your meds are right, and the social worker will help you with like your insurance and things like that. The spiritual counselor comes in and says, hey Sue, like how's it with your soul? How's your heart? How are you today?
Mm-hmm.
Holistically, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And we get a lay of the land of where you are with your disease. And I'm glad you mentioned your family, because a huge part of the spiritual care piece is families. So your spouse, your close relatives, your whomever is your favorite sister, or whomever is in your
Right.
life. Those people are also adjusting, right? Like as you well know too, there's a huge impact on your loved ones. And so sometimes that's going well and sometimes it's not. And religiously, like people are all over the map, right? So people are lapsed Catholic, never darkened the door of a church since my wedding, or Protestant, attending a church, not that close to my minister. They really accept the hospice chaplain instead of their own pastor, or in addition
Mm-hmm.
to, and all different kinds of religions: Buddhist, Jewish, Wiccan, Nazarene, Hindu, uh, and oftentimes, let's say if we get a Buddhist patient, they might prefer their own Buddhist clergy, and that's
Mm-hmm.
totally fine. We completely accepting with that. And so, yeah, and we also do a lot of bereavement work after the person has died. And the Medicare benefit is a year plus a month. And the
Okay.
reason is that, you need that first month just to like take care of business. the immediate
Right.
business, you're not really, most people aren't really fully in their grief yet. They're kind of
Right.
numb. And so that's why they give you a month plus 12 months that
Yeah.
you can come and have bereavement services in a hospice. Actually, Care Dimensions, where I now work, does a little differently. They have a whole department for that. So typically, we will send letters. We will do calls like 2 weeks after, and then maybe once again later on. We can do in-person visits. We have those online grief support groups that you mentioned that I have been working on in the past very heavily. And then there's like all kinds of stuff in the community, which is a lot of what you do, right? So
Right.
yeah, that's a little bit about what we offer.
Yeah, I think that, that's one thing that I didn't think about, was that, there's anticipatory grief, right? So when you're, as a family member or the friend or, the close people to the person who's dying, you have that anticipatory grief that you have to deal with. And then after they die, then your grieving process after the loss kind of starts. And I was not aware, and I bet a lot of people are not aware that there is that benefit from hospice to continue with that kind of care, with that grief support.
Yeah, and it's so amazing. Like, I mean, it's not really long enough, which is where my sort of academic life picks up the conversation. Because, okay, what else can we do that's way better than what we do now? And there's a ton of room for improvement, even though the services are really good. And people, just need to call. They just need to pick up the phone or shoot an email. Plus, every hospice is also required to offer those services to anyone in the community, not the calls, but the groups. So,
Yes.
like if you Google grief groups in Massachusetts or any state really, and you research that, you can pretty much join most groups. Some of them have a kind of a, you have to join by a certain day, and then the membership closes for 6 weeks and then they open it up again.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
so people maybe might like to know that, that those services are out there.
Yeah, I think that's really important to know. Um, so one of the things that I know you did, because we talked a little bit about it, was the starting these virtual groups during COVID. So I was kind of wondering, with the with hospice being so, one-to-one kind of focus where you're going to the person's house or something, how did that work during the pandemic?
Oh, that's such a great question. That you know, it's sort of a theme in life. I think, it's like very cliche, but a door slams shut, a window opens, and that was the case for, I think, many of us in hospice. Well, at least in psychosocial um, work and hospice, myself included, where COVID was horrific and people were dying um, off camera, if you will. Actually,
Hmm.
they were dying on camera because sometimes we were holding the iPhone by the hospital bed of the person dying of COVID, right? We were completely gowned up in our whole full um, protective equipment. And a couple of times like that, FaceTime with the person was the last time that family member would see the person, their loved one, and say goodbye that way, which was um, essentially causing complicated grief. It's like
Yes.
folks whose loved ones die overseas in battle, right? It's like in Vietnam is a perfect example of that, or really any war, I guess. But you just never got a chance to say goodbye. And or the way you said goodbye was so tragic and disjointed, and you don't even know if the person heard you. And so the chaplains came into this breach at this
Mm.
moment. Like there's this beautiful phrase in the Hebrew scriptures in the book of Esther: for such a time as this, that she was a queen, an unlikely queen for such a time as this to save her people. And that's kind of what we did. It was like, oh, this is our time. We're jumping in.
Yeah.
It was really hard. A bunch of people quit and never came back or just went to do other things. Somehow, by grace, I stuck it out. That was a total God thing that was happening. And so that was maybe the first part. The second part is that after those deaths occurred and kept occurring, obviously, right, until COVID was over, um, people were people who were in normal grief were just suddenly in heightened grief. And then you had
Mm.
people whose loved ones died of COVID in a variety of difficult ways. My husband and I were just talking about ventilators, and his point of view is, I don't know if this is medically right or wrong, that ventilators were actually medically unhelpful, that
Mm.
the use of ventilators actually hastened more deaths than they should have. So there was a lot of mistakes that were being made, and a lot of conversation around the vaccines and such. Anyway, um, alongside that was this folks who loved ones died of COVID, um, who were in deep grief, right? So you have these kind of two levels, like normal grief in a pandemic,
Mhm.
and then COVID related grief in a pandemic. So those groups of people kind of funneled into our bereavement group, which my then hospice said, okay, you can take this online because we can't see these people in person. So go take this group onto Teams, and it kind of gave me carte blanche to do what I wanted. And
Right.
my social worker and I learned how to do teams, learned how to do groups, totally self-taught. There was no time to take a class.
Right.
And the groups continue today. And they are small. They're like microcosmic, right? It's not 100 people. It's like maybe 8 people at a time. Some have suffered the loss of a spouse, the loss of a child, the just general loss.
Mhm.
And most hospices have these groups. I don't know how many have them online like mine, or on Teams, on
Right.
video like mine. But Sue, like, again, just a total gift from heaven of being able to lead these groups, kind of create them, and be a bit of like a container, right, for what people were going through. And so that's kind of what my research is headed in that direction, because I want to do more of that, and I want to do it differently and better.
Right, right. Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So with the work that you're doing towards your doctorate, um, that's something that you're focused on is these different kinds of ways to help people, right? That are grieving. Is that
Yes,
the
yes,
high level of
exactly.
it, not the detail?
Yeah, the high overview. Yeah. I'll just, I'll give a shameless plug to Boston University, which is School of Theology, which is where I'm studying. It's a wonderful institution within a huge institution. Um, it happens to be where Martin Luther King also got his divinity degree. So how cool is that?
That's
Like, we
cool.
walk in the
Yeah.
steps of giants, our tiny feet in those huge steps, but footprints. But so it's got a very big justice focus, BU School of Theology, and the doctoral program there it's about practical theology, so taking your belief system, whatever that is, and it's a multi-faith, and
Mhm.
like, how can we do better of taking that to the world and doing good things in the world, like right now, not just
Yeah.
being in the ivory tower talking, as fun as that is, about all the theory, but like the practice of it, which
Yeah.
I'm very interested in. And so it's practical theology, and then it's also for transformational leadership, because the face of ministry, chaplaincy, pastoral care, church ministry is changing rapidly.
Hmm.
Our churches are shrinking, mainline Protestant churches are shrinking. That's my denomination. And so it's like a really interesting time to be in this work. For me, I'm going to be writing this whole next year about how to take a page from my first career, which is writing, and I'm going to be working with expressive writing. So people who write about expressive writing, like James Pennybaker and Natalie Goldberg and Julia Cameron, who does The Artist's Way. Like, there are a lot of people out there who are trying to teach us how to use writing for healing purposes and for
Hmm.
creativity and for self-affirmation. And then there are also a lot of really interesting writers who are just writing their grief narratives. So I'm sort of taking all that, using expressive writing as a tool, and I'm going to create 4 workshops where we help folks basically practice really super easy writing that anyone can do towards healing from their grief, loss, change. And it doesn't have to be someone died. It could be the
Right.
loss of a relationship, a home, a job, uh, a role, like I was a mom and everybody left and now I don't even know who I am, or
Right.
whatever. But also any kind of loss. And multi-faith, multi-age, all will be welcome once I build this thing. And so I'm really excited using the framework of some of my best teachers. One is named Dr. Shelley Rambo. She's a theologian who's trauma informed at BU
Hmm.
School Theology. She's incredible. Dr. Rambo wrote this book, Spirit and Trauma, where she looks at Holy Saturday in the Easter
Hmm.
cycle and how it's kind of a day we don't really focus on. We focus on Good Friday and He is risen on Sunday, but Holy Saturday is a descent into hell. And she writes about how Jesus goes down into hell and like he's as far from God as you could imagine. And he sort of is in hell with us. And
Mm.
it's like the total absence of God. And he also doesn't have God either. And like through his spirit, through his breath, through this possibility of hope, like, we rise with him out of hell and, you know, we come to Easter together. And so, like, to me, exactly, that's a big piece of what the chaplain does is like we kind of
Right.
enter into the hell of loss with people and we walk with them. We stay there. Like we're not, I'm just saying a good chaplain is not afraid to just be there, like to just
Yeah.
be, with you in that, whatever that is, however long it takes. That's why some of our visits are really long
Yeah.
and they don't go by the standard, regulations, always bumping up against that. And like, how can I walk with you through whatever it is you are experiencing right now and be a companion, offer you some tools, maybe writing, maybe yoga, right? Maybe something
Right.
else. Maybe you're like a fine arts person or music, or maybe you're a scientist and you just want to like reason your way out, like
Yeah.
wherever you are, that's kind of where. But this particular project is using the arts to try to make that a more like imaginative process.
Okay.
And so yeah, I want to partner with folks like you and folks like my sister-in-law who does movement education at Brown Medical School. And my piece of it is going to be writing, but then when we actually, launch the workshops, I want to have a big second half be the movement. So I hope you'll
Right.
join me.
Right. So yes.
I'm counting on you.
Yep, I will. Yeah, one of the things that you were just talking about in terms of being a companion and walking beside somebody, that's really difficult to do. Because our natural tendency, I think, and we all, including me, I mean, we all fall into it, somebody you're speaking with a friend or an acquaintance and they've just lost, recently lost somebody or had some experience of loss. And what you immediately want to do is say, "Oh yeah, I understand that. Yep, that happened to me last year, or my father died through, whatever." Instead of like not saying anything and just listening and, just being quiet. And that, wow, that takes a lot. I mean, I've been practicing that myself. Um, and it's really hard. It's really hard not to
It's
talk if you're a
it's
talker.
really it's really hard not to talk. The silences, the um I just I think I mentioned to you, I'm studying coaching because I think it's a great tool for grief work and ministry. And so in coaching, we have this power of the silence, the
Mhm.
power of the pause, the like intentional silences. So if you and I are talking and I suddenly go quiet, let's say you're my client, like all this stuff is going to come to you in the quiet, and I
Right,
think that's
right.
true of the chaplain work in grief care. Um, yeah, like of course I'm doing a lot of talking right now, but if you and I were working together, there'd be a lot more silence, there'd be a lot more time for breath, there'd be more time for like, just sitting with each other. That is really hard. Coaching is amazing training because it teaches us what it's teaching me is not to try to fix you or come in with the answer or be like, we can just pray through this and it's going to be better. Yes, I believe God, is love and can change the world. Of course, I believe that. I'm a Christian
Right.
minister. And like you, that might not be where you're at today, if ever. And so, like, I'm also learning in my training how to just kind of help the client find the answer for herself, and that
Right.
is really, I think, I mean, this, right? Like grieving, unfortunately, it's kind of a lonely road. I think we can hugely benefit from community. I think we
Right.
forget about community sometimes. It's very isolating, which is, I hope my groups, like your groups, foster community. Um, the more I live, the more I realize I need other people, which is partly why I reached out to you. Like, I don't know, I'm just gonna go in the dark here and email
Yeah.
this cool person who's doing some things that I'm also interested in. And I'm glad I did because look what happened.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, um, it's it's a skill, it's an art. Like you learn sort of when to come forward, when to hold back. Um, I have a former pastor mentor of mine who left church ministry for other wonderful things. And he once said, he had a prayer which is like, help me to know when I need to speed up and when to slow down. And I always remembered that. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, that's such a great prayer.
Yeah.
So it is a cultivated learn. And you have bad days where you're like, I don't know. And inevitably on a bad day in the field with clients and families, something amazing will happen. Like a patient or their loved one will just do or say something that is just like a total game changer. And I'll
Mm.
take out my phone and be like, I have to write that down. I can't believe you just said that.
Right.
Whether like they have some epiphany or they realize that like life really is good. Like I have lived the life that I was given and it's okay. I'm going to be okay. Like
Yeah.
whatever their okay is, like they get to this
Right.
place and you're like, oh my gosh. Because that's kind of like, I don't want to say when that happens, and it's okay if it doesn't, I feel like I've done something for the person, like I've brought some little tiny measure of understanding or awareness or like hope or, and sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes a person is just going to go down fighting, and nothing
Sure.
I say
Yeah.
or do or don't say or don't do is going to change, that it's going
Right.
to be more anxious and more agitated. And hopefully medically we take care of the anxiety and the agitation. But some folks, and that's another thing, like I have to know, Sue, when it's like, I'm not fixing this, I'm not changing this. As I said before, like I'm just going to try to be here, and maybe I'll have
Right.
a chance to show up a couple times, and the rest I have to leave up to sort of, the spirit. Because like, and it's frustrating sometimes. You're just like, okay, I guess I just have to walk away. That's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
hard, because you can see there's a path, and you're like, if you could only, but
Yeah. That person doesn't see it. Yeah. I understand. Is there anything else that you would maybe like to share with our audience? Other, any tips? People that might be in a situation where they're looking for
yeah, I mean,
hospice. Yeah.
yes, I think that in some ways, not to be downcast, but I do think in some ways we all have losses in our lives. They might be small, they might be large, they might be old, they might be new. I sound like Dr. Seuss, but like I think we really all have loss or change. My sister-in-law is like, "Oh, don't say grief. It's really depressing. You're going to turn people away." Well, yeah, and that's the work I do.
Right.
It's like Anderson Cooper has a whole podcast on this. Like, it's okay to talk about grief. You have a whole yoga practice on this. So I think demystifying grief, which by the way is the same word as the grave, gravitas, serious, um, it can be heavy, but it also is, I think, so powerfully a part of the life cycle. I
Hmm.
have I'm a Christian minister with Jewish ancestry, and so I am really connected with the whole cycle of life in Judaism, and the cycle of days and cycle of the week and the Sabbath, um and I think the Christian and Hebrew scriptures both really try to help us understand, and probably many other sacred texts, I don't know, like help us understand that there's a unity, to our
Mm.
experience. There's so many similarities between birth and death, so many. And obviously there's sudden death and there are accidents and there's traumatic death that is a whole different category. And even there, and especially there there is possibility of integration, of your loss, of finding a new path for yourself. It's not
Hmm.
something you ever forget. It's not something to be diminished. um, it becomes part of the fabric of your life
Right.
eventually, with time and with care and with dedication and with community and reaching out to people, trying not to be siloed. Easier said than done. There's times when we need to be alone. I'm not saying that, but like if there's one thing I could leave people with is to try to see loss as the flip side of love, which is something a
Yes.
friend of mine found a lot of comfort in when she lost her beloved father. And she found that online, and she was like, Krisha, this is everything for me. And it, it if we love, we're going to lose. We might go first and the people are left and we're the one they lost, right? But like the loss is built into our human condition. It just
Right.
is. And so if we can somehow like uh befriend, or pinky, like little pinky out, and try to make contact with that in a way that's makes it less scary. We're also going to go through that someday ourselves.
Right.
um and so it's not like looking at the world as a sad place at all. It's actually the opposite. It's like, you know what? Joy is possible. Joy is possible in all things. Like that's a biblical promise. And That's really why I do this work. It's because of joy, the possibility of joy. I think C.S. Lewis has a book about that, Surprised by Joy. He lost his beloved wife and it
Right.
totally changed his life. Great book. Um, I have a lot of books, by the way, if anyone wants to talk to me about what to read. So I think that's what I'd leave you with. I mean, I don't know if that's true for you, if that's what you've experienced, but there's still life for us after loss. And
Yeah.
that's why I'm doing this crazy thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. And thanks, everyone. I will have information on how to get in touch with Krisha and a little bit more about the work that she's doing in the show notes and in the transcript of the episode. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.